Tribal ceremony. So now I'll already give you an example of one poem written by a member of a minority group. Before moving on with the video, listen to me read the poem Tribal Ceremony by Janet Campbell Hale, a Native American poet. Try to pause the video and write down the answers to these questions. What is the situation here? Who is present at the situation, at the place this is taking place? Where are they? What are the main differences between the speaker and her father? What is her relationship to English, to the English language? What was her father's relationship to the English language? So I'm going to read the poem now without interpretation. You may want to read it on your own and think about the questions that I asked you. Tribal Ceremony by Janet Campbell Hale. I lay my hand upon the coldness of the smooth white stone. My fingers touch the words. I read again my father's name, date of birth, date of death, veteran of World War I. This is your grandfather's grave, I tell my children, wishing I could tell them that they would understand that the man who was my father was of that generation, born on old land, newly made reservation, that at 12 he went to mission school to learn to wear shoes, to eat with knife and fork, to pray to the Catholic God, to painfully learn English words, English meanings, white way of thinking, English words to speak, to think, to write English words when we, my children and I, know no others. Might be a good idea to pause the video, read the poem again on your own, and think about the questions before you go forward. So now I'm going to read the poem again with some interpretation. I lay my hand upon the coldness of the smooth white stone. What kind of sensations are being described here? It's cold. There is something distancing about the stone. Coldness suggests a distance and lack of life. They're also at a cemetery. It is not warm like a human touch. It is also smooth. Nothing can stick to it or hold on to it. It slips away. Of course, this is a realistic description of a headstone in a graveyard, but we need to ask about why she chooses the exact words, why she decides to describe it in those certain way. You could describe a stone without talking about its coldness or its smoothness, but she wants those adjectives. Thus she mentions that the stone is white. Literally it means just the color, but could whiteness have another connotation? Maybe, especially in the context of our course. I'll get back to it. My fingers touch the words. There's a contact not only with the stone, but with the words inscribed on the stone. I read again. This is something she does read again and again. Maybe she thought about it again and again. These are very significant words for her, and it's significant that they are written in English, not just what they say. It says my father's name, date of birth, date of death, veteran of World War I. His name and dates and another detail. That's what you have on the gravestone. Another detail is that he fought in the First World War. He was enlisted into the American Army, probably. Is there a problem with being an American soldier, a Native American soldier of the American Army? There might have been. It means maybe that he's fighting a war that for a Native American seems very far away and not relevant. The World War I was mostly in Europe. This is your grandfather's grave, I tell my children, right? It's in quotation marks because she tells her children. And now we hear what she can't tell her children, what she wished she would tell her children, what she's trying to say when she's saying, "This is your grandfather's grave." Wishing I could tell them that they would understand that the man who was my father was of that first generation. It's first generation of what? Notice she's telling us what she does not know how to explain to her own children. She needs a poem to express what is difficult to express in normal conversation. The part of the power of literature is that it gives us an opportunity to say things that are difficult to say or to explain in other contexts. So what is this first generation of people born on old land, newly made into a reservation, newly made reservation. We see a contrast between the oldness of the tribal land where the Native Americans lived and the newness of its status as a reservation when her father was young. A reservation is an area in the United States set out for Native Americans to live, that is not taken over by Europeans. These were presented as the reservations were presented as a humane solution compared to earlier policies concerning Native Americans, which was basically to expel them, to chase them away from where they live and even massacre them when they did not go. So the reservation were more humane than that. Yet the reservations were and still are in many cases very difficult places to live. There's a lot of poverty, a lot of alcoholism. They're far away from anywhere where you can find good work, and generally it's a very poor solution. It's a place where Native Americans have some autonomy, but they also lack funding and infrastructure. This place can be more restrictive than actually preserving. So he was this first generation of people to live on the reservations as they were created in the 20th century. Her father, went to mission school. Mission school is religious Christian schools that were created for Native Americans specifically. They were forced to send their children there for the most part, or else this was the only source of education. They were often very rough places, and anyways, they were places to civilize, as people would call it back then, or give them a new culture, make them forget their older ways or see them as wrong, and teach them new things, including a change of religion to make them Christian or more Christian at least. These places try to civilize Native Americans, make them more like Western white people, to integrate them into a more modern or a more Western society, but without giving them a choice of what to take and what not to take, just giving them the whole package and very little freedom about what they wanted to learn, especially for young children who are separated from their parents. It could be very traumatic and leave you with a lot of knowledge about Western civilization, but not a lot of knowledge about your roots in the Native American community. There are often a lot of traumatic stories about these mission schools. So what did he learn in the mission school? To learn to wear shoes, to eat with knife and fork, an example of Western European ways that are clearly not really better than any other way. It's just a convention. To pray to the Catholic God, giving him a new religion. You get a new religion, but it means that you have to lose your old culture and your old ideology and your old ways for a new one. To painfully, notice how many lines starts with to, followed by a verb. This one is not followed by a verb, it's followed by an adverb. Thus, it emphasizes the painfulness through the difference in grammar and the end of the line, which is an enjambment, before we get to the verb. So, to learn to wear shoes, to eat with knife and fork, to pray to a Catholic God, to painfully. Like it almost stresses the painfulness because we expect a verb and we get an adverb, and the next line we get the verb. To learn English words. Okay? English words are painful, and that's one of the main themes of this poem, is the issue of English and learning English words. You remember there were also words inscribed on the gravestone itself. Here we get to the major point. Part of what the father learned is language, a new language, English, or at least to write English. What does learning a new language entail? What does it mean to learn a new language? So yes, he learned words. That's what it means to learn a language, but it's not just learning words. He also learned English meanings. Language is not neutral. It's not just a vehicle for saying what you already wanted to say. Language determines what range of meaning you can express. When you learn English, you learn English meanings. Things that you can express and cannot express in English. And in the mission school, the father learned new meanings as well, not just new words. Ones that at least at first were foreign to him. White ways of thinking. Along with language, you get ways of thinking, ways of looking at the world, new perspectives. So if you have the freedom to keep speaking your own language and learn a new language, that's wonderful. You learn new things, new perspectives, new ways of thinking. That's great. But here, the English language comes to replace any other language. You don't only gain new ways of thinking, you lose the old ways of thinking. And the new ways of thinking can actually hurt you sometimes. It's not explicit here, but we can easily imagine that these new ways of thinking include racist ideas about Native Americans and their culture. So the mission schools would often talk about how white civilization and even white people are better than Native Americans, and Native Americans would have to accept it. And even if they didn't teach it explicitly, the curricular, what they teach, will always give the message that what happened with white people and in Europe and in part of Western civilization is more important than what happened to Native Americans. So again, English words, these reflect the ones on the gravestone as well as the ones he learned. She repeats to speak them, to speak, to think, to write. English words, to write. Whenever a poet mentions writing, here she talks about her father learning to write in a new language, but she's also thinking about how she uses language to write her own poetry. To write English words when we, my children and I, know no other. Here we have a very painful contradiction and conflict in the poem. The father was made to learn English, and ways of thinking as something foreign. He's the first generation to speak English. His child and his grandchildren were already born into a world where English was the only option. The language that is foreign to him was the only one he had to communicate his history to his descendants, to tell his story to his descendants, to tell them what to do even. We can feel that not only one man is mourned in this poem, but a language, a culture, a way of life, everything that was lost because he went to the mission school, or the way the mission school operated. This is a minority's way of life that was destroyed, not necessarily by direct physical violence. In the case of her father, it wasn't a genocide like what happened to a lot of other Native American tribes, but through the power of the dominant white culture. So it wasn't due to physical violence directly, but because the culture is so dominant, they can tell other people what to do and what to learn. Hale and her children, or the speaker and her children, already speak only English. She can only communicate with her father in English. She can only write about him in English. The poem is about the idea of writing in a language that is not completely yours. English is described as a white language, as a way to communicate white ways of thinking. But the poem is also about not having any other language to write in. So the only language she has is this language that is colored by Western white ways of thinking, that is foreign to her father but already her only option. The speaker is only English, even though it does not feel like her language. Like it feels like it belongs to someone else more than to her. Not only does the father not speak, but the speaker of the poem herself finds it difficult to explain all of this to her own children. She has to write a poem in order to communicate it. She can't say it as part of the ceremony at the grave site. Note that the language isn't just language, it's also ways of thinking. Language and education determine how we think and what we can think about. And the speaker only has white ways of thinking. She must find a way to mourn this loss. So she's mourning her father, but also mourning the loss of her native language and her native ways of thinking. So to generalize somewhat, a lot of what minor literature is about is writing in a language that doesn't quite belong to you. It belongs to people who oppress you. It was not created to suit you, it was created to suit them. English is not a language created by Native Americans, it's a language created in England. And the people who control what the language needs to look like for the most part were for a very long time only white people. Minor literature is about trying to carve out a place with a majority language and ways of thinking. To find a place where you can use English to talk about Native American ways of thinking, or to use English to talk about African American experiences, or in this poem, to use English to mourn the loss of the other language, the other way of thinking. After all, and despite all the problems with the situation, she writes the poem in English. She doesn't really have a choice. It's worthwhile thinking about the title of the poem. The poem is called Tribal Ceremony. What would you expect from a poem titled that way? I think tribal suggests that it still belongs to the tradition of the old ways of Native Americans. It's part of the tribal culture. We might expect to read something about a ceremony that reflects long-held beliefs, something with masks or totems, something an anthropologist might study. But the ceremony she described, going up to the gravestone marked with English words, is mostly Western, or at least not marked as specifically Native American at all. Perhaps there's a kind of disappointment of expectations, and maybe that's part of how the poem is about the gap between the speaker and her father, how their histories are so different, how their experiences and ways of communicating are so different. We are left to ponder to how and what extent it is a tribal ceremony. To what extent this ceremony is tribal, connecting us to the tribal past and tribal history and to the community of Native Americans. Can it still connect the people present at the ceremony, the speaker and her children?